Welcome to Syntax. Today we've got an awesome show for you today. We have Johannes Schickling on today. You may know him, founder of Prisma, but we're not here today to talk about Prisma. Johannes is honestly like one of the people that I watch for what's coming in web development because he was early on GraphQL, very early on TypeScript. Seems like he's very early on local first right now. So quite honestly, when he's working on something, we're going to watch, you know? So he's working on two things right now, which is, I'll allow him to explain a little bit more, but Overtone is a local first music app that sits on top of Spotify, Apple Music, things like that. And Effect, which is a TypeScript's missing standard library. It's kind of a library for writing TypeScript apps that are composable or reusable, schema validation, error handling, some pretty nifty things in there. So we're going to talk to him about both of those types of things, as well as like diving a little bit more into local first. So welcome. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Super excited to be on the show.
Yeah. Well, before we get into it, Wes, one of the things that Effect does really well is it makes working with your errors really organized and easy. And you know what? So does Sentry. This show is brought to you by Sentry, the perfect place to track and log all of your errors and solve them for the bugs that Effect is going to save you from having in the first place. So we'll be talking about Effect a little bit more in just a second, but let's get into first and foremost Overtone. Do you want to talk a little bit about what Overtone is and maybe why it's interesting and unique?
Yeah, totally. I'll start with the why first and then to the what. Since like in the past, as you've mentioned, in the past I was working on Prisma, and I built Prisma in order to help other app developers deal with some of the insufficiencies that I've been facing when building apps. But after I was able to take a sabbatical from Prisma, I was really urging to get back into the app development shoes myself again. And there was like one particular thing that's been on my mind for a long time, as I'm a big music enthusiast and like I listen to music from a lot of different places. And I never really found like a good home for my music. So I was hoping there eventually to be like the right music app for me in the same way I'm using Superhuman, for example, as my email client, or for so many things I can have my own client and like a client that's for me. But I never found that for music. And then I also at the same time came across like some other apps which really inspired me in terms of being high quality, super fast. And since no one built the right music app for me, I figured, okay, this is a good app for me to kind of just get up and running as an app developer again. Like I started building a little prototype, etc. And one thing led to another. And I really fell in love with the entire use case and with the entire approach. And it developed more and more. And I really saw, oh, this has a lot of potential. So this is me coming from a little prototype into developing this into an ambitious idea. And right now, the idea is really to, like, as you can use Superhuman or Mailbox or whatever email client you want to use, I want to have the same experience for music. Since like I listen to music on YouTube, on Spotify, on SoundCloud, I buy my own stuff from Bandcamp and from other platforms. And this is kind of scratching my own itch, and it's such a huge community.
Yeah. So you mentioned Superhuman there. For people who might not know how great Superhuman is, I was one of those people who before I used it, I was like, there's no way it's that good. Can you maybe go into just a little bit more detail in terms of like what does that experience feel like? Not necessarily Superhuman, but like the experience you're trying to reach that you get in things like Superhuman.
Yeah, I mean, I start out with like to underline your anecdote. It's hard. Some things you have to try out for yourself to really appreciate what the rave is all about. I think for Superhuman, they advertise with just like the speed, the productivity, and just most people don't love doing email. So whatever helps you get through that more quickly and more delightfully is a huge deal. And for me about music for me is like all about joy, all about like the emotions that music evoke in me, and like that I can like go from one track to another, what people share with me. But right now, listening to music, either you're all locked into like a single platform like Spotify or something else, and like someone sends me a link of like, oh, like I don't have access to that platform, or so this is like the joy gets lost very, very quickly. And when I find something good, that just like becomes another browser tab, maybe a bookmark, whatever. So I never really had that platform or like the tool that natively works for music. So I wanted to have a joyful place where I can just like let my music stay. In the past, we had like maybe on a shelf, I had like my music collection. I would feel really proud about that. And we no longer have that. We maybe have like a Spotify link, literally like a track that I fell in love with like 3 weeks ago. I went on a road trip, saved it for offline. I came back and Spotify has since removed it, so I can no longer listen to it. And this sort of stuff is like 1,000 paper cuts. And I just want to make sure that music is enjoyable. The paper cuts are gone, and it's nice to listen to music and deal with it. And so, but for email, it's all about productivity. I think for music, it's all about joy. And I want to make sure that it just works and the software is doing what you would expect. And that means I want to raise the level, the quality bar to a level where maybe like macOS has set it once with a Finder, or where Figma has set it in terms of like how you can work with a design tool. And I feel like so many apps are being rebuilt as web apps, and what was once like a native app and you could really strike for high quality, that's becoming so much harder, and things rather feel like websites. You scroll somewhere, reload the site, like it has forgotten where you were before. And so I want to turn the dial to all the way max, all the way the best experience in the domain of music.
Wow. And what makes a good music app for you then is, and does that play into it being local first?
So what I found is the best enabling paradigm is like, my theory is that local first is the best foundation to build high quality apps in general. Superhuman is one example. Figma is also actually pretty local first inspired. Another one that a lot of software developers use is like Linear, that's also local first. So a bit of like a theory that's unfolding is that I think the next generation of like all the next apps, I think will all, if they want to be the best, I think they will one way or another go in a local first direction, as you already see with Linear. And I think in the case of what is important for Overtone as a music app, first and foremost is like it should play back music in a way that you have just nothing to be annoyed about. If you hit that play button, it should start immediately. If you hit the pause button, it should stop immediately. If you like select something, everything should just be very immediate. No loading spinners, all joy. But that's easier said than done.
What are your thoughts on starting a mobile or a local first app as a local first app instead of taking an app that exists and trying to add local first features? In my experience, trying to make an existing app local first was very, very painful. Is that something that you've noticed? Is there any improvement in that world?
So a bit tongue-in-cheek, I would say, is like the entire term local first is right. So you start with that way. And if you don't, that becomes kind of tricky. So if you have like a more like, say, like Rails inspired app, as like we build most web app these days, whether we use something like Next.js or Remix, they all sort of follow the similar paradigm where like the user experience is on the client, but the most important stuff is all happening on the server. And this is like almost this tug of war in terms of like, oh, like who has like the authority in this? And this creates this tension. And what you're trying to reconcile now is like move more, like empower the client more, but fundamentally you've at some point made the decision, no, like the entire authority sits with the server. And that creates like that really tough tension that's tough to reconcile. And what local first is all about is really say like, hey, let's empower the client as much as possible, as much as the domain allows. And in many domains, such as like something like TealDraw or Notes app, etc., all the stuff that's being created is being created on the client to begin with. The server just plays like a mediating role that like helps you to get stuff from one device to your collaborator. And those make great use cases. And if you flip it really, and ideal, maybe from the start, maybe through a bigger rewrite, empower the client as much as possible. That makes it really easy. But if you start out from like a server authority all the way, then it rather you try to take a step in that direction, but that's typically just done as like a more and more glorious cache. But you need to flip it and like say, no, this is actually not a cache. We have like a data architecture where this is the source of truth. And the server is almost like a cache in some way.
Interesting. And let's talk about the actual tech behind something like this, because you think like you just said, empower the client, meaning like do as much work on the client as possible, and then the server is just a cache, which is a really interesting way to think about it versus like when I think of a website, I think like, the server does a lot of the work, and then the client we're just clicking and displaying data there. So if you're building something like Overtone, you obviously have like a database, you need somewhere to do some sort of like processing of your work. Like, what are the other parts of building in an app, maybe in the context of something like Overtone?
So what might be surprising to most app developers is like for Overtone, as it is right now, I don't have a server. It's all the client, like good old Winamp. Fun fact, Winamp apparently still has like 42 million active users. But aside from that, like Winamp is just like a local client app that plays music. Through like Winamp was built in a certain time. By now we have cloud. Most music comes through some like a platform like Spotify, etc. But for my music client, the Spotify servers are doing the work. I just need to be a client for that. So the use cases for which I need like a dedicated Overtone server are so minimal that I have started out building Overtone and not yet having that server. A bit further down the road, I will add one, and that only responsibility will be to facilitate the syncing between the devices. Since we're not yet living in a world where peer-to-peer works everywhere, like you might be in a cafe and you have your laptop and you have your iPhone, and you can't quite rely on those communicate directly with each other. They might need to go through some server that facilitates that. But the syncing, which is very intuitive, I feel like I have stuff on one device and another, and now they need to talk to each other. And a server facilitates that, but the server is like no authority in that regard. So I try to do as much as possible on the client. What you've mentioned, like the sort of like little checkboxes that we associate with building an app, like a database or a server, all of those jobs to be done happen in the client. I literally have a database baked into the client.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what one are you using there?
Yeah, so this is where I had to reinvent the wheel a little bit for my use case. I consider myself to be kind of like enjoying pioneering work, technical pioneering work, where I feel like, there has to be a better way. Is this crazy? Probably yes. Let me try. And then kind of like 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, and like then rinse and repeat. So, and I was lucky enough in 2020 to be connected to some other great people, namely Jeffrey Litt and Nicholas Schiefer, who have done a 2-year research project together with that was called Riffle. You can find it on riffle.systems. The idea was exactly that. Like, what if we want to build richer client-side apps? What do we need for that? And an idea was like, hey, let's actually... What do we need to build apps? We need to deal with data. And what best primitive there is to deal with data? Well, it's a database. But traditionally, you always had like this databases in a server, or possibly even more traditional, where we had only desktop-grade software.
Yeah.
This is where we had a database actually in the client-side apps. We kind of forgot about that over a few generations, moved it all to the server. But now I think the pendulum is swinging back a little bit. So the idea was like, hey, let's bring this primitive to manage data, a database, into the client directly. There were a few technical breakthroughs or innovations that now facilitate that in the web environment, the browser environment, namely WASM. So the idea was to use SQLite as an embeddable database, bring it directly into the web app. SQLite typically is rather kind of more request response. You send it a query, gives you the result back, end of story. But what you want in a web app is that it's reactive. This is what we're used to from like Redux, MobX, Zustand, all of those sort of like client-side state management tools. But so this is what we had to do then. Like we added a layer on top of SQLite that made it reactive. We also didn't just want to express everything as SQL queries. By now we're also used to things like signals, etc. So we added like a signals-like layer also on top of it. So we have reactive SQLite. You can compose it together with things like signals, but also add a layer of like transactionality there. That's really important. When you, for example, click in Overtone on play, and you might see the same track maybe in a track list, but you also see it at the play bar in your track queue. You don't want that to kind of like take many renders that like one thing shows a play state, the other still shows a pause state, the other shows maybe another track. You want like almost asset guarantees from a traditional server-side database in your client-side app that everything happens at the same time. So all of this, we like set out for this goal. We want better state management locally. And this is what led to Riffle, which is the foundation for Overtone.
Wow. How do you handle authentication in this kind of setup?
So I would also like invite to switch the perspective a little bit. In a server-side context, the server is not yours. The server is possibly exposed to everyone. You absolutely need authentication. In a client-side context, how do you do, like, let's say you have like text edit or Notepad or something like that. You'd not think about how do I do authentication for Notepad. You just open it, you put the stuff in it, and like you save a file on your hard drive, and that's it. Like you having physical access to your machine is like all the authentication you need. And for a lot of local first software, that's enough. If the data is on your device, or maybe you piggyback on something like iCloud sync, etc., then you don't even need authentication if you can embed yourself in an existing system. If you want to build applications that really that looks a little bit more like a social network where everyone is connected to everyone, that's less of a good fit for local first. But typically, if you're like in a circle of trust, like in the context of like a company or a family, etc., this is where local first works really, really well. And this is, you just need like a one-time getting access. You could like punt on that and say like you could just have access to that in your, like maybe you're using Tailscale or something. So you really don't necessarily need authentication as much. It can be almost more of like a binary thing that you can handle very easily. And in the case of Overtone, like Spotify does the authentication. You just enter your Spotify credentials, I connect to you, and there's nothing more.
Yeah, so the authentication is you have implicit access to the database, right? Like if you are
it's allowed, your database.
It is your database. So it's either on your computer, which is protected by other things, or it's either on a local network, which is already a privileged environment, right? Or you said like use Tailscale, which is like you could VPN and then you have access to that type of thing.
Yeah, or even I guess for syncing, you would potentially, if you're not using iCloud or whatever, you could potentially auth into a server somewhere to sync or to set up syncing. I guess that
exactly.
Would be, okay.
Yeah. And it's That's very cool. Use case specific. What does your domain require? And then you do it. Whereas like if we're building an app with Next.js, etc., this is where we have all the checkboxes. How do you do file upload? How do you do like authentication? How do you do...
Yeah.
And so now we can rather focus on the domain and then really see like, oh, we don't need to do any of those things because it just works. Like if you open TLDraw, there's like, you can just use it right away and still there in your browser. And that's so liberating.
Yeah, you know what? It's funny that I noticed, sorry, Wes. One thing I noticed is that people oftentimes, they'll start with the tech first and then work to the app that they're building. All right, I need to build a site. I'm going to build it on Next.js. And these are the features that I need. Instead of starting with the problem at hand first and then picking the tech from that problem. And that really, the way you're talking about, thinking about which apps specifically work well with local first, I think that's a big consideration a lot of people need to have when even choosing, even just the conversation of server-side versus client-side rendering in those aspects, or what you actually need out of the network. I think those are all big considerations.
Exactly. One cool thing about this entire thing is also that aside from it being a bit new, it can also, there's so much stuff that we invented over the years, and then like we haven't even touched on like infrastructure. Where do you deploy it? Do you put it in AWS? All of like the different AWS things. Local first can really kind of back to the roots, back to the what you really need. And it collapses so much of like the stack bloat that we have created over the years that it can really like out of 10 things that you need for a traditional app, with local first, you can get away with doing 2 things and then spend the rest of your effort on making the app great.
I'm curious where like heavy lifting happens when you're doing a local first application, right? So you spin up, you have a scripts.js file, you do work in there. And at some point, you're either going to need to do something that is going to block the main thread of JavaScript, or you're going to need to do something in a language that is not JavaScript, right? And if that's the case, you usually will think, okay, well, can I use a web worker for this? Can I use some sort of WASM package that I can run some non-JavaScript language, but still run it in the browser? What's your approach to that?
So I think it always depends, right? So depending on the on your use case, depending on the shape of your data, the cardinality of your data, etc., you might need different trade-offs. So I think something like TL Draw, for example, can get away with an entirely different architecture compared to something like linear. In TL Draw, the entire complexity stems from sort of like the rendering. It needs to be really, really smooth, but the amount of data is probably much smaller. In linear, in a larger company use case, you might have thousands of issues. Each of them have like different comments, etc. So this is where you might have much more data, but the frame rate might not matter as much. So all of this requires different trade-offs. So to build a local first app, particularly today, where not everything is like fully, there's no rail for local first yet. So I need to build more stuff yourself. So this is why I enjoy pioneering this. But I think in a couple of years from now, this will actually be in many cases easier than to take like your traditional web app and try to make it linear great. So right now, you need to understand your trade-offs and then make those trade-offs decision accordingly. So typically, good rules of thumb is like protect the main thread. So on the main thread, you have like whatever stuff you're doing might block it, and that results in jank. So like you click on something and then you can't scroll or whatever. So if it's possible to do something on a worker, I think that's typically a good idea. However, that might also come not for free in terms of a simplified mental model. In a traditional React app, where you might use something like React state, use state, etc., this is where if you click a button and that causes a set state, it's right there in the next render. However, if you would now do something that would cause some change on the web worker, then that needs to go through an async boundary. So at that point, you already have a distributed system. Stuff can get out of sync somehow, and stuff gets more tricky. So you want to find a good balance where the stuff that needs to happen synchronously happens on a main thread. The stuff that can happen out of band, you maybe move it to a worker. But typically it really depends. Like on TL Draw, you need to be really careful about like the rendering, the canvas. In other cases, you need to deal with more state management. For the case of Overtone, I found like this balance that I embed SQLite in the main thread. So I need to be careful about my frame budget, but SQLite is so incredibly fast that I can per frame run dozens of queries at the same time without blocking the main thread. And I can get that beautiful synchronous simplicity. And then I do like other heavy lifting on other threads. So in Overtone, I also need to deal with like cover art and like transcoding media files, etc. So I do all of that on worker threads. Some of that code is like implemented in Rust and then compiled to WASM. Wow. But you could do that however you want.
Wow.
And the SQLite library that you're using, Is that just a library that looks like SQLite and saves to like IndexedDB, or is it like a WASM library, or like is it actually SQLite? How does that work? Like, how did you get SQLite running in the browser, I guess is the question.
Yeah, so there's a few different pieces to this. So if you want to learn more about this, we've written up like an essay on this on riffle.systems. So this is where you can understand the details a little bit more. So there's a few ingredients for this. Number one is getting SQLite to run in the browser in the first place. There's been a bit of like a history to this. So there's been SQL.js, which I think back then has been pre-WASM already been possible to run in the browser, not as performantly, but already, and that's quite a feat of engineering. But at some point, it was also then possible to compile SQLite to WASM and run it there. So there's like two parts to this. One is like running SQLite. SQLite can run in memory, or it can also run on top of like some persistence layer. Persistence layer, let's say you use an Electron app, or let's say you use an app on your Android or iPhone. This is where SQLite is then persisted to your hard drive, or an Electron also to your hard drive with like just a file somewhere.
Yeah.
And so in the browser, you either run it in memory, where it's super fast, but it's not persisted to anything, or you then also persist it to something. In the browser, we have limited options to where to persist something to in a reasonable performance way. So the traditional option has been IndexedDB over the past couple of years, but there is now also a new option called OPFS, Origin Private File System. That's what I'm using, and that's taking care of the persistence.
Oh, okay.
For the case of Riffle, we've taken one step further. We wanted to get the best of both worlds of having super fast queries. You get the fastest queries by doing everything in memory, and you can get synchronous queries by doing it on the main thread. So we run both SQLite on the main thread, but then we also sync it to another SQLite version running on a worker, which is responsible for the persistence. So you just need to know all of this if you care about it, and if you are so crazy that you work on something like Riffle. But from a user perspective, from an application developer perspective, it's basically as simple as using something like MobX. And this is just stuff you can geek out on if you're curious.
Oh, so that's built, your state management is the same thing as your database layer.
Exactly.
Is that right? Oh, that's awesome.
Exactly. This is basically gives you, if you want to have something like MobX, but a bit more power, and you also want persistence and so on. This is what we've been going for with Riffle, which Riffle is concluded as a research project, and I'm now developing it further under a new name called LiveStore, and I'm hoping to open source that at some point as well.
Oh,
Cool.
sweet.
Yeah. One thing I had seen before was WA-SQLite. Is that in any sort of relation? Is it less featureful than what Riffle is trying to accomplish?
So Riffle currently uses a SQLite WASM build that is by the official SQLite team. There's a couple of like other projects that also experiment with different trade-offs, different optimizations to bring SQLite into the browser. The most notable, besides the official SQLite WASM build, is the WA-SQLite build, and that's been really innovating on a couple of fronts in terms of optimization, speed improvements, etc. That's a really cool one, and I think it's by a person, Roy Hashimoto, I think, and that's brilliant. But Riffle sits like a layer on top of that.
Cool. Okay, yeah, because I'd first heard about the WA-SQLite from Electric SQL, which is a really cool project too.
Fun fact, I'm actually integrating LiveStore and Electric SQL since they work really well together. So I'm an advisor to those folks as well. And this works really well together since LiveStore is all about the client-side state management, and Electric SQL is all about, you have an existing Postgres database, and now you want to sync somehow to the clients. So this fits together like a glove.
Yeah, awesome.
Let's talk about your TypeScript project as well. This has been pretty popular in the last couple of weeks. People have been talking about it. It's Effect, which is, I'll let you give us the pitch. What is Effect for TypeScript?
So I should clarify, it's not my project. It's a project that I got involved with like 3 or 4 years ago. And since then have tried to contribute to and help other people better understand it. And it's still overall a work in progress in both in terms of making it easier for people to pick up and as it's developed. But we've just recently hit our first production milestone, given that we took over the effect package on NPM, which already had a 1 and 2.0 release. Now we released it as 3.0, which is technically our 1.0, but it's been already in development since like 6 years. And in JavaScript dog years, I think this makes the project quite old already and quite mature, and that speaks to the ambition and the thought that has gone into it. So I don't just rethink a little bit of like how I'm building Overtone in terms of state management, in terms of following the local first ideas, but I also felt like, okay, the way how I'm generally building the business logic with JavaScript, with TypeScript, there's been so many things that have been bothering me in terms of like how error handling works, etc. So when I set out to build this project, I landed on local first, I landed on like those state management ideas, but I still had all of those other things that bothered me. So I've been looking around, like, how should I build this? I was even considering building it all in Rust, since I think Rust has a couple of like, by now, like better trade-offs in terms of how the actual program language works, etc. But I wasn't quite ready to slow down my app development speed by having to babysit the memory management all day. So I was still drawn to the affordances that JavaScript and TypeScript gives you. But I was looking for some of like those more modern ideas how to build an app and the better primitives. So in the same way as like back in the days when I built some websites, some web apps with jQuery, and then React came along and just blew our minds by like this, like the abstractions it provided. Like now we could think in terms of components and really freed us up from having to think about moving DOM nodes around, etc. And we could care about those components, they would fit together, etc. And I feel like there's something like that missing in the JavaScript world. Sure, we have functions, etc., but they just tell you half the story. You can you have some parameters that you can put into a function, you get something back, but that's not all. Like so much of your code depends maybe on a global thing somewhere, or it depends on like a database connection already being established, or it's like you need to really be aware of like, oh, that thing could like throw with a user not authenticated error at any moment, but also with other errors that you've already forgotten about, that somewhere deep down in your program could go wrong. So there's the stuff that's typically on our mind is like the happy path, but there's so much the non-happy path that we just don't have any affordances in JavaScript and TypeScript to help us with that. And this is where I've been shopping around for like the right ideas, and then ultimately found those right ideas in some other programming ecosystems, namely like Rust ecosystem, Swift ecosystem, Scala ecosystem. But I wanted to have those in JavaScript. So I was looking for, is there some project that takes those better ideas and implements them in JavaScript? This is how I found Effect like 3 or 4 years ago. Back then, still under different name, very, very tricky to get into, was all about functional programming back then. Since then, it had really de-emphasized that part in the same way as like React is all about functional programming, but no one knows that really. So it's kind of been this Trojan horse that turned like every React developer unknowingly in a functional programmer. Same for Effect. It's basically takes some of those good ideas but makes them more approachable. And this has been the foundation for like how I'm building everything with TypeScript these days. So this just gives you a little bit of like a motivational blurb at this point. Yeah. But I can get to the what is it?
Yeah. Someone's listening right now and say, is it a framework? Is it a React alternative? Is it state management? Is it just a bunch of TypeScript helpers? What is it?
So I think in a way, like you could frame it from each of the angles that you've just mentioned. And to go one step even further, as we've just launched the 3.0 a couple of weeks ago, on Twitter, a couple of people like framed it as such, like, oh, Effect is almost like it's a new programming language, but within TypeScript. So in a way, I would say this is right. Something like Rescript or whatever those things were called before, they're all like trying to go take quite a big step away from JavaScript and say like, hey, JavaScript is beyond repair. We need a new program language to bring along those great ideas. And then we compile to JavaScript. Effect has like a similar ambition and say like, hey, there's so many things that we could do better, but the world clearly isn't ready to move to another program language. JavaScript, TypeScript is here to stay. So let's try to see how can we bring as many of the great ideas into TypeScript with like all the good stuff that we have today. There's so much good stuff that is happening today where like you have new environments such as Bun, Dino, all of that trying to make things better. You have better testing stories with VTest. You can run JavaScript everywhere. You have VS Code with TypeScript. All of that is fantastic. But now we need to innovate a little bit more on the way, how do we actually write our applications? And so this is where Effect, similar to how React is all in JavaScript, all in TypeScript, and gives you some new ways how you can structure your app, namely components, etc. And then you mount it somewhere, and then everything just works. Effect is similar to that, but kind of for the complementary domain, which is not about view programming, but more about general business logic. So let's say you have your like async functions where you call one async function from another, and then in there you throw, etc. Effect lets you structure those things as so-called effects. There's actually like some academic research behind that over probably decades build up those like new primitives. Those are called effects. You can call one from another. Think about them as like kind of like a async function with superpowers. And the superpowers are that you have much better control over how errors happen. So you also on a TypeScript level, you know, oh, these errors can happen. But you also get things such as like type safe context. You might be familiar with like the React context. In React context, in your components, you can access a context value anywhere in your React tree. But you really need to make sure that somewhere outside you wrap all of that in a context provider. Otherwise, like you get default value or it just blows up. So you don't have any type safe affordances to like if you use a certain thing deep down, React doesn't tell you, oh, you still need to provide that. With Effect, you get a type safe guarantee for that. So if somewhere in your program you might use a like let's say like a S3 thing that like you can access a file from S3, then Effect on a type safe level, or rather TypeScript, will force you like, hey, you can't yet run this entire program. You first need to provide us like somehow with like a S3 connection. So if you want to like sometimes that's also referred to as like dependency injection. Dependency injection has a really bad rap because it's kind of been always like fingers crossed and like does weird type things. With Effect, that becomes really, really beautiful. And like all like TypeScript has such powerful type inference. That means like if you do something somewhere, the return type automatically becomes the right thing. And now you basically expand the same nice stuff that we use and love on a daily basis, not just for the return value, but also for errors, also for the context. And so Effect just gives you those like different layers of new superpowers. Better concurrency management is also another one. Like in TypeScript right now, what like we're mostly can deal with like promise.all, but if we want more over that, this is like where things stop. Like let's say you have like you want to go through 100 HTTP requests that you want to go through. Do you say promise.all like 100 URLs? No, then you do like 100 at the same time. So you might want to do like 10 at the same time. But then like if you have done 9, do you need to wait for the last one? So you want much better control over like concurrency as well. You might then reach for some like PQ or PMAP. And this is where we have
we just finished a show on this. We recorded last week. We were describing a whole bunch of ways to work with promises and queuing and concurrency and synchronous. And It's true. Like the whole business logic of working with multiple promises is kind of held up by Sindre Sorehouse's packages for that type of thing. And what maybe you can tell me if I'm understanding this correctly, like effect is just like when we got promises in JavaScript, things got really good because we were able to compose things and take one promise from a random package and another promise from another package, and they work together because it's a standard primitive that we have in the browser. So my understanding of this effect is that if we have everything as an effect in our application, we get better type safety, and then we're able to do the business logic of asynchronous code, error handling, which is a big pain in TypeScript, not being able to type your errors without doing a whole bunch of wrapper functions around it, retrying, concurrency, interruption. I think I understand it. Like you have this like primitive, which is an effect, and these common things that we all do, retrying, error handling, interrupting, composing, queuing, that's all built into this library called effect.
Exactly. And there's just like, I could keep going on now about new or better superpowers, like, for example, observability or interruption, abort controller stuff, all of that, like everything gets better with effect, like in the same ways, like everything got better with components. Once you started embracing components, so much good stuff happened. Like you could share them, you could compose them, you could like do so many things with that. And this is what effect enables for like general purpose programming. And it is quite a little, like it didn't take you just like 5 minutes to get started with React, like having known something like jQuery before. You need to rewire your brain a little bit.
Yeah.
But once you get over that hump, and by now it's default, but once you get over that hump, you've rewired your brain, everything starts making sense and click into place. So there's a similar thing going from A to B now with effect as well. But given I've rewired my brain like 4 years ago, I can't imagine going back and I'm like more productive than ever.
Yeah, it does feel like, I mean, a lot of people have been calling for more Rust-like, whether that's like match for resulting in errors or things like that, features within JavaScript itself. And it seems like that's probably a long shot in terms of something that you probably don't want to wait for if that were to even happen. But you could just, in the meantime, or even just instead use something like effect and get these higher language features within your TypeScript projects. Yeah. You know what? I found the docs to be really convincing too, in terms of the docs do a really good job of showing you the before and after kind of. So you can see, all right, this does look clean, even if I am using some things that maybe feel a little bit different than what I'm used to. It looks clean, it reads clean, and the fact that it's easier and gives you all these features, it feels like a big win. What's one of the cooler things about effect that often gets overlooked in the conversation around it?
So for me, it's like it's all about composition, really. And like composition is also similar to the beginning of our conversation. Like, oh, if someone has never tried out like Superhuman, what makes it cool? Oh, you have to try it for yourself. Like some things, but like composition, if you went from jQuery to React and you could then like see, oh, I could use like that thing over here, can reuse it here, or like then I move it. I was like, everything just becomes so much smoother. Like the groundwork is no longer there. So for effect, it's that where you can just use other people's things. Like for example, in effect, there's a concept called a schedule. Like when you have an error that happens in your app, what do you want to do about it? Show a nice error message, but maybe there's something more actionable you can do. Let's say you make an API call that fails. You might want to try again, but how do you try again? Do you just like hammer the server like 10 times in a row, and you might even get rate limited, and it's even worse than before? So in effect, there's like a very easy way to retry something. There's like a schedule. There's a concept of a schedule to retry something. And that schedule can be defined in itself. Like someone else could define like, hey, this is like the exponential backoff schedule that works best for GitHub, or here's the one that works best for OpenAI. And then you can just like with one line of code import that and use it. Whereas like if you wanted to implement something like that without effect, it would just like litter your code with like tons of layers of nesting, and if you want to then do that concurrently somewhere else, it's just crazy. And the other thing next to composition, this was an example of composition, is just that in programming, we deal with so many very heterogeneous use cases. And so one use case, and like different use cases require for like different approaches. So for example, there's one approach that might require like for very concurrent handling, some other use case that requires for very sequential handling, or another use case that where streaming is the best approach. And for each of those, we need to go to very, very different corners of our NPM world. Like if you want to go streaming, it's like, oh, like now you're RxJS maximalist and like everything becomes a stream. But some things are a poor fit for a stream. And then like there's no reconciliation so far for like that very heterogeneous aspect of programming. And in fact, everything, it feels like very homogeneous, and everything, like if you've learned to use like one module, you already know how the others work. And this is, I think, one of the biggest blessings in the JavaScript community, where we have such a wild west of different package flavors, different APIs. You learn one thing and you don't know how to use the other one. In effect, everything fits like a glove once you've learned once.
Wow. Has anyone dipped into building a web server with this? The first thing I saw when I looked at all this was, oh, that would be nice for TypeScript middlewares, where like if a middleware modifies something, the function down the road, Hano does a decent job at this, but it's sometimes hard to type it when you're not directly inside of it. Has anyone done that?
Yeah. So here you're pointing at a really interesting question that also I kind of like came to this conclusion early on in my effect discoveries, where I realized, okay, so this is this better way to build something, but hold on, does that now mean we need to like wrap all the existing things? The effect community would say yes, but even better, we're gonna rebuild everything. And that's like super audacious in one way, but crazy to see how far we've already come. And so by now, like there's almost like a effect native equivalent to most of the popular things in NPM today that's already part of the effect ecosystem. So for example, there's like Zod. Effect has a effect native equivalent called effect schema, or tRPC. Effect has a thing called effect RPC. Effect RPC is also the thing that would enable your use case. When you want to build a web server, you typically want to build like some sort of API-ish thing. With Effect RPC, you can get that, like you can get like a open API server out of the box. There will also be like a GraphQL thing, etc. It's almost like in Rust, you have such a vast standard library. You don't really need to reach for like some third-party thing. It's just part of the language, just part of the standard library. And think about this the same way with an effect, that it's just part of the ecosystem already. And
I see.
Obviously, this is today in 2024, we have not yet covered as much surface as we might have like in 2 years from now. But it's so surprising how far we've already gotten, that like I have, just in terms of the stuff that's in my package JSON that is not part of the effect namespace is like shrinking. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I have like 5 more things that are not part of the effect ecosystem, and they're like shrinking.
Wow. Do you think this will ever get Bluebirded? Meaning like Bluebird was the big promise library that everybody used before we got promises, and now we have them in the language, and now we see things like signals. There's been a pipe proposal out there for a while. Do you ever see the language evolving to a point where this is something that's built in?
So I love that comparison. And in one way, I would say, boy, I would hope so. Since I think it would remove a little bit of the debate of like, hey, what is this? Since like no one really questions too much of like a JavaScript feature. Oh, it's like part of the language. Guess I'll learn it. Guess I'll embrace it. And with that effect being a bit of like this weird new thing, now it's like to really rewire your brain takes a little bit.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I would say there's probably 30% of effect that step by step will find its way into JavaScript that effect can then embrace or say like, hey, this part we no longer need. But I think some other parts are that's just the way how JavaScript is right now. Deal with it. So for example, just look at the TypeScript issues in regards to explorations to typed errors. When you the way how you do errors in TypeScript is through throws. And there's been many, many explorations of what could we, similar to Java, could we have checked exceptions that we say this signature also could throw this and this and this. But TypeScript being not really the language, JavaScript is the language. You can do anything in JavaScript. So with effect, you have the benefit of saying hey, this stuff is an effect, so we can give you much better guarantees for it. And so this level of attenuation, the effect ecosystem can afford. But with JavaScript being the thing that we're stuck with and not TypeScript, it's not the TypeScript runtime, it's a JavaScript runtime. Yeah. So I think some things just can't really be fixed. Another example is promises. Promises is a very interesting domain just to better study. In a way, the fastest asynchronous code that you can write in JavaScript is still callbacks. JavaScript is sort of syntactic sugar that come with its own performance implications. Whereas, for example, if you do an accidental await somewhere, the code that will run afterwards will come in the next tick. So this can become a performance issue. That's very easy to fall into this trap. The other thing about promises is that they're eager by default. So if you have a promise, that ship has sailed. You can't say the thing that was originally this promise, let's say an API call, do it again. Well, you can't tell a promise run again. There's just already a handle to the value. And you can't really, you don't know what has happened here. And so this is fundamental. The semantics of promises are defined by now, very different to what other languages have arrived at. And I think there's been this interesting anecdote recently that one of the very instrumental examples that we designed effect after is a Scala project called Zio. And the author of Zio recently gave a talk at the Effect conference where he said, actually, Effect's going to have a much wider impact than Zio had for the Scala community. And the reason why it's here to stay is because JavaScript has made its design decision around promises. JavaScript is here to stay. Promises are cursed. And this is a better approach. Interesting take. I tend to agree, but the future will show.
So now's the part of the show where we talk about sick picks and shameless plugs. Johannes, did you come prepared with a sick pick today?
Yeah. So I've been thinking, what is a more broadly applicable sick pick that works for or can provide some inspiration for the wider developer audience that's also a bit in line with what we talked about today. And one encouragement that I would make for most app devs is think about observability more. Probably the way how you debug is probably just very console log driven. But there's been actually some very serious innovations and improvements been made that's all summarized under the term of observability. And so Sentry is obviously a big leader in the space. But I think there's just some overall ideas that are agnostic to various vendors. And I think a technology standard that stands out there is OpenTelemetry, which I think also works with Sentry. And this is partially also a thing that just works out of the box with Effect, but also works in other, pretty much in all language stacks, all technology stacks. OpenTelemetry is already supported out of the box or is on the roadmap. And I think this is a thing that's very normal in other programming communities, other language communities, but not as common yet in the web community. So I would just encourage app developers generally to take a look at OpenTelemetry, get an understanding what it means to instrument your application, and then see whether it provides value to you over your typical console log driven development. For me, it's really been like such a game changer to better understand what is happening in my app, that it really changes the way how I develop.
Wow. We need to have someone from Sentry on to talk open telemetry. I'm sure there's a lot of smart brains around the Sentry office on that one. So got to get into that more for sure. Sick. What about shameless plugs? What would you like to plug?
So here is only one valid choice for me right now, which is the Local First FM podcast, which I've started recently, since there hasn't really been a good home for like everything local first, where we can go deeper on a specific rabbit hole. And so I started that podcast a while ago, and since had a couple of really interesting conversations there. For example, also had one of the innovators of the local first space there, James Long, but also had other really prominent persons there, such as like Martin Kleppmann, Peter van Hardenberg, Rasmus Andersen. So lovely conversation so far. Going a bit deeper, it's going down some rabbit holes there. So maybe not for everyone, but if someone found the local first stuff intriguing, this is a way to go deeper.
I gotta say, since you dropped the first episode, which is really where I even heard the term local first for the first time, this has been the only development podcast that I subscribe and listen to. So it's really hard for me to subscribe to dev podcasts, considering we do one 3 days a week here. And I just want to say big ups to that, because it's fantastic. And I've really learned a ton from this podcast. There's a lot of really great future tech stuff. So definitely give it a subscribe.
Thank you. That means a lot coming from you.
Thank you. Yeah. Well,
awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate all your time on this. It's really interesting to dip into it all, and we'll catch you later.
Thank you so much.
Peace.